Hey everybody, today I wanted to make a video on how I go about writing unit tests for my Nest.js applications. I may make another video about integration testing in the future, but the idea behind unit tests is that we're going to test each file individually and mock any dependencies that file has. So we're strictly testing the code in that one file, and the idea being if we have sufficient unit test coverage on every file in our application, we should expect things to work in the way we want, which is obviously important. And as always, this project will be on GitHub. I've actually branched off of a previous project I've done, Nest.js Mongo, so I'll include the link to that in the description. And on that repo, I've checked out a new branch called unit testing. So you can see there's abstract repository and unit testing. So you can just clone this repo and then check out the unit testing branch if you want to follow along. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is the Nest.js Mongo project that I have. And important to note, this is the one we've set up with the abstract repository. So I'm going to show you how to unit test this abstract repository as well today. So the first thing I like to do is, so we're going to have a test folder in each of our separate domains. So our users folder here, we're going to have a test folder, and I like to host all of our test files in this folder so we keep the actual logic of our application separate. Okay, and now in this test folder, I'll go ahead and create a test file for each one of our files. So one for our controller, repository, and service. So let's go ahead and start with our controller. So if you remember, our users controller defines the routes for our application and will interact with our user service. Now, as I said before, we're going to be mocking the user service, this dependency, and really just testing that this controller is calling the correct methods on the service with the information that we expect. So let's go ahead and do just that. So we'll go ahead and create a new file here called users.controller.spec.ts. Now inside of here, we're going to be using Jest for our testing framework, which comes right out of the box in Nest.js. So we'll have a big describe block that wraps everything, and we will describe users controller and provide our callback here. Okay, so now that we've set up our describe block, we're going to go ahead and create a before each block. And so this is going to be an async block. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get the module ref. We're going to create our testing module, which is similar to how we set up a module, a user's module. But in this case, we're just going to instantiate the things we need to get the user's controller. So to make this a bit more clear, we'll call this module ref, and we are going to call test from Nest.js testing dot create testing module. And this looks just like a normal module from Nest. So you'll have an import section, and then we can define the controllers that we want to instantiate. So in this case, we know we have the user's controller, that's the one we're testing. And now importantly, we can provide any providers or dependencies that this controller requires. Now if we go into the user's controller, we know that we are expecting to inject the user service. So we need to provide this appropriately. So let's go ahead and provide the user service. Next, we're going to call compile on this, so we actually compile the module. Great, so now that we've done this, we need to step back for a second here because, as I said before, we want to be mocking the user service here. We don't want to actually be testing the implementation of our user service. We're going to do that separately. So in order to do that, we need to create a mock or a fake user service that will still have all of these methods, but we're going to have dummy values that will be returned that we can spy on in order to ensure that they do get called, and they get called with the information that we expect. So there are many ways to set up mocks in Nest.js and Jest. The way I like to go about it, and the way I found it to be cleanest, is to use auto mocking. And auto mocking is really great because it allows us to find one mock for each file, and then we can use it in multiple places. So in order to take advantage of auto mocking in Jest, we create a folder at the root level of where we want that mock. So for example, we want to mock the user service. So we're going to go ahead and create a mocks folder here that is directly adjacent in the project structure to this user service. So it's going to be in the same level of the user service. That's very important. And notice the naming structure for the mocks folder. It's 2 underscores mocks 2 underscores, which is important for Jest to pick it up. Now inside of here, we want the same exact name as our user service down here in order for Jest to pick it up. And now what's really great is we can export a const user service here, and we want to have the same name in order to not confuse Jest at all. So user service, and then we set it equal to the mock that we want to create. And what's really useful is we can call jest.function.mock return value, and we can return an object that has the methods that we want, because if we think about it, the user service really is just an object with methods on it, and Jest allows us to mock an object, and we can supply these dummy functions that return information that we expect. But what's also really great is that the dummy functions that we define here are automatically going to be spied on, and we'll see why that is helpful in a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at the functions that we're going to need to mock here. So if we look at the user's controller, there's a get user by ID. Okay, and very similar structure. We're going to call jest.function, and here we're going to mock a return value. And now we need to think about, what's the data that we expect to be mocking. Well, if we look here, we know that get user by ID should be returning a user. So let's go ahead and actually look at what the user looks like. So we can see here that this is our user that we've defined, our user schema. Now we want to define some sort of stub data, a stub user that we can return from our mock here, and that we can also expect to be getting back in our controller. So in order to do that, I like to create a separate folder in the testing folder called stubs. And here, this is where all of our stub data, or all of our sample data that we're going to be using in our test, can be hosted in one spot, which is pretty useful. So in the stubs folder, I'll create a new file called user.stub.ts. Now we could just outright export an object like this. We can export user stub. We know it's going to be of type user, and we can fill it out here. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is just dummy data that we're going to be passing around. Now we could do this. We could just export a const here, but the danger is that objects are passed by reference. So we have the potential danger of if we use this in a lot of different places and someone mutates this object, it could have unexpected results. So instead of doing this, I'm going to export a function actually called user stub, and this function here is going to return. We're going to go ahead and return the user object. And so what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to, every time we call this user stub, looks like we just need an extra bracket here. Every time we call this user stub function, it's going to give us a new user stub object, so that we don't share it between our tests, which is pretty important. And I just realized my return type actually needs to be over here. So now, every time we call this user stub function, we are going to get a new reference to a new user stub object, so we don't share that between our tests. So that's great. So we have our user stub here. Now we can go back to our user service mock, and for get user by ID, we can simply call user stub, and now we're returning a new user object. So let's move on to see what other functions we need to mock. We have get users, so it's going to be very similar. In fact, I'll just go ahead and copy it down here, and this will be called get users. And the only difference now is that we're returning an array of users, so we can simply declare an array literal there. Next we have create user, And we can mock another return value. I believe this also returns the user. And one other thing I've noticed too is that we're actually returning promise with a user wrapped inside of it. So if you want it to be even more clear, you could change this to mock resolved value, which just states that we are going to resolve the return value because it's a promise. But either way, it'll still work. So lastly, we have one more function here, and that is update user, and that's going to be just the same as create user. So now we have our user service properly mocked. We have all of our functions that are returning our stub data, and we are ready to go. So let's go back into our users controller test. And now we need to tell Jest that we want to mock our user service. And this is quite easy to do, which is one of the reasons why I like auto mocking. It's just a one-line call. We need to call jest.mock, and we just need to point to where the user service is. So that'll look like this, users.service, and that's all we have to do. That's great. So now when we run this test and we provide the user service to the providers right here, Jest is gonna actually, instead of supplying the normal user service, it's gonna supply the mocked value here. And this is great because we can do this anywhere where we want to mock the user service very easily. Instead of having to define mocks in multiple places, we are hosting it in one place. Okay, so the last thing we have to do in this before each block is actually get references to our users controller and our user service so we can write some tests for them. So I'm going to declare two lets up here, users controller and the user service. So this is just so we can access them anywhere in our testing file. We don't have to keep redeclaring them. And now before each block, we'll set our users controller equal to module_ref.get. We'll define the type, it's a users controller, and we just pass in the type. So we'll do the same thing for the user service here. Okay, and one last thing I like to do in the before each is called jest.clear all mocks, which if we look at what it does, is it goes ahead and clears properties of all mocks, which can be useful to do if we've maybe modified a mock to return a value for one test only. This will go ahead and clear that before each test, which can be helpful for dealing with some tricky bugs. Okay, so now we've set up everything for our unit test and we're ready to actually test our code in our users controller. So if we go ahead and look in the users controller, we're going to want to write a unit test for each one of these functions. And it'll be pretty basic to do because we only have one line of code in each one of these. So first let's start off with the get_user function. So I'm going to go ahead and write a describe block. We'll call it get_user. Now there's many different ways you can write your unit tests. I really like the style of given, when, then, derived from Martin Fowler, I believe, where we do our setup code in a given and then when blocks, and then we can actually do our tests in the then block. So it helps us separate things out. Sometimes it can be overkill, but I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like. So we'll have another block here, and we'll say when get_user is called. And now in this block, this is where we'll actually do the setup work and call the function. One of the important principles for unit tests to keep them clean is that we want to write, or we want to do one assertion for each one of our tests. And so this structure allows us to do that pretty nicely. So there's two things I want to test here about this method. The first of which is that when we call it, I want to make sure that we are calling getUserById on the user service with the user ID that I've passed in. And then I also expect that we return a user that has the same user ID. So these are two different assertions, and I'm going to write two different tests for them, but the setup code will be the same. So let's write a before each block here, and this is going to be async because our method is asynchronous. And inside of here, this is where we will actually call our function. So we're going to call await users controller dot get user, and this is where it expects the user ID. So I'm going to call stub user or user stub, and I'm going to call user ID, so that we're going to pass in a user ID. Now, in a later test, we're going to want to test the return value here. So we'll create a let up here called user of type user, and we'll set the return value here equal to it. So now we have the user. So now that we've gone ahead and set up our test, we can make our assertions. So this is where our then block comes in. So now I'm going to test, then it should call user service. And let's test that. So what's great now is that since we've already set up our mock with this jest.function, it's automatically spying on this, and we don't need to do any more setup to spy on these methods. We can do it directly in this test now. And so it looks like something like this. We'll do expect user service dot get user ID. Two have been called with, and now we'll call it user stub dot user ID. And if you're using the user stub a lot for the one test, and maybe you've modified it in some way, you could, set the user stub equal to a let up here. But in this case, we're not doing that, so this is sufficient. So now we should expect the user service to get called, and let's go ahead and actually test this out. So we'll open up a new terminal, and we'll do, I believe it's yarn test users.controller, and we'll see what the results look like. So it looks like we have an issue with the user service being found, and so let's just make sure. So it looks like we actually only need to go up one directory here. Let's save that and run again. So now our test is passing, and another good thing about this given when then structure is that it's pretty clean when you read the output. So we can see users controller, get user. When get user is called, then it should call user service, and we'll have a then block for each one of our assertions. So let's go ahead and do another one for the return value. So we can say then it should return a user, and now we can assert that the user that was returned from our users controller call to equal, and we'll call our user stub. So what this is doing is it's asserting that the return value from this method is directly from the get user by ID, which we've mocked already. So we know that this should be our user stub, and now we can assert that, which we've done in our users controller. So we can go ahead and run this test. Great, so that's going ahead and passing. So now that we've set up a test for the get user function, I'm going to go ahead and challenge you to write 3 more unit tests. One for the get users, one for create user, and one for update user. It should have a pretty similar structure to the one we set up here. You should test that not only are we calling the service with the correct parameters, but that we are receiving the expected value from the service as well. So go ahead and try writing some tests for these. I'll go ahead and show you what mine look like after you finish. Alright, so I've gone ahead and finished adding the unit tests for the remaining 3 functions in our controller. So our get users test here looks very similar to the get user one. The only thing is now we're expecting an array of users. So down here, we're expecting that the user service.get users is called, and that the users up here is a array of our user stubs. Now next, create user is a little bit more complicated. I have 2 lets up here, one for the user that gets returned when we create, and the other for the create user data transfer object that we pass in to create user in the controller. Now I've built this create user DTO because it's only a subset of the stub user we have, but we can still use the same properties. So I have the email and the age, we pass it in here, and then when we expect that the user service.createUser is called, we can use to be called with and expect that we're passing in the createUser DTO email and age, as well as expect we get the user stub back. Lastly, we have the update user, and this looks similar to our create user. We have the update user DTO, and now we have an age and a favorite foods. And now we call update user, we pass in the user ID of the user stub and the update user DTO. And then on the update user function in the service, we expect it to be called with our user stub user ID and the whole user DTO object. And then lastly, we expect that returns the user stub. So these are all the unit tests for the controller. Now let's go ahead and move on to our repository. Now our repository is going to be a little bit more complex just because of how we have set it up and how we're extending our abstract repository. But it's not terribly difficult, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file called users.repository. Now I'll create my big describe block, or I call it users repository. And so just like we did with the users controller, we'll have it before each block that is async, so we can set up our module reference. We'll declare a module ref here, and we'll set it equal to await test, import it from Nest.js, create testing module. Now we're going to have to provide an array of providers here. We don't have any more controllers now, but we do have providers, and obviously the provider that we're trying to test is the repository itself, so we're going to have to provide that to Nest so it can instantiate it. Now importantly, if we go ahead and take a look at our users repository, we'll notice that we are injecting, we're using the inject model tag here from Nest.js Mongoose, and passing in user.name, which is the name of the user object that we have. So we need some way to mock this injection that Nest is doing for us. And the way we go about doing that is we can create a custom mock for this provider, or not a mock, but we can override the provider. So to do that, we specify which provider that we want to override, and we call this function getModelToken from Nest.js Mongoose, specifically for this testing purposes, where we can get the token of the model, which is how Nest.js identifies it in the context of a module. And then we just need to pass in the user.name, similar to how we do it here with this injection, and we'll have to import user as well. And now we'll specify use class to tell it which class we want to use to mock the functions on the model. And by the functions on the model, I mean if we go ahead and actually look at the abstract repository, so the functions here that we're actually calling on the model, like find one, save, find one, and update, that's the mock that we want to override. So we want to provide a mock to use that for. Now we could create one mock in this users repository and replicate it for every test repository we have, but I prefer to follow our abstract approach here. We have an abstract repository, so let's create an abstract mock that we can use and set up easily for our repositories in the future. So to go ahead and do this, I'm going to go ahead and in the database folder that we have, I'm going to go create a new folder here called test, because this is going to be a test related file, and I'll create another folder called support in case that we actually do have test related files. I want to keep this out of that scope. And now in the support folder, I'm going to create a new file called mock.model.ts. So this is going to be our mock model. So let's go ahead and export an abstract class. We'll call this mock model, and this is going to take a generic type, which will be of the types, the stub type that we are passing in or instantiating in our subclass. So we'll go ahead and declare it here an abstract property entity stub, which is going to be of type T. Now we don't want to provide this through the constructor, and we'll see why in a second here. And the reason being is because we're actually going to use a constructor for something else, and this is how we're going to be able to spy on the instantiation of a new model. So if we look at the create function of our abstract repository and we see what's going on, we first instantiate a new entity model, so a new model, and then we call save on it. So when we're testing this out, we want to test not only that the save function gets called, but that we are in fact instantiating it with the data that we expect. And I found the easiest way to do this is create a constructor in our mock model where we expect to get that data of type T. And then we call a kind of dummy function that we can in fact spy on. So I found this to be the easiest way about going about this. Maybe you have another way. So here we'll declare the constructor spy, and this will just be a useless parameter, and nothing really goes on here, but this is just something we can spy on to make sure that the constructor did get called with the data, which is important in the context of the model. Next, I'll declare my find1, which is going to return an object with an exec function that will return the entity stub. So let's go ahead and return just that. So it's of type T, and we're going to return this .entity stub. So that's the find1. The find is similarly going to return that exec function, but it's going to be an array because we have multiple stubs being returned. So exec, it's going to be an array, and then we'll just pass an array of our entity stubs. So the last two functions we have to do are async save, which in this mock is going to be a promise of type T, and we can just return this .entity stub. And lastly, async find1 and update. Similarly, it's a promise of type T, and we'll just return this .entity stub. So now we have an abstract mock model in our database folder. So now what's great is if we go back to our test folder in the users directory, we'll create a new folder here called support, right? And so now this is separate from our test files, separate from our stubs. It's a support folder, and we'll create another file called user.model.ts. Now to set this up, all we have to do is declare a new class called userModel, and we'll say it extends our mock model, pass in a user, and now the only thing we have left to do is to provide our stub so that our mock knows what to return. And so this is going to be a user stub. Great, so now our model is all set up. And see how easy this is to do if we have multiple repositories. So now if we go back in here for our use class, we can provide it the use model. So we'll call compile on this, and so we'll get a reference to the user repository as well as the user model so we can perform tests on it. All right, and we'll get also user model, which will be of type user model. So let's get both of these with our module ref. Lastly, I'll call that clear all mocks that I like to do between all my tests. So let's go ahead and create our first test. So we'll write a describe block for our find1, and we'll say when find1 is called, well, we know that we're going to have a user here. So let's declare let, and let's set up our test. So we'll have it for each with an async because it's going to be an async action that we're going to have to call. So now we're going to want to spy on the user model that we have set up. And what this spying does is it just watches, it tells Jest to watch the function on whichever class we provide. It tells it to watch it so that we can later expect to it have been called with args or a certain amount of times. So we didn't have to do that in the user's controller spec, and that's because we had already created this mock here. And by default, when you create a function with this jest.function, it automatically spies on it for you. In this case, we don't have that, so we need to tell Jest to wait and look at this function so that we can expect it later on. So now we'll actually call users repository.find1, and we're going to need a filter query. Now, I noticed that this filter query is something that's going to get used quite a lot in our tests, between our tests. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'll actually declare it up here as a let user filter query, and we can say filter query of type user, and before each we can reset this in case it got modified in any way. So this way we don't have to keep redeclaring it, but each test it's going to get reset. So now up here we can just pass in our user filter query. Okay, so as we'd expect, we should then call the user model. So we'll expect our user model dot find one to have been called with our user filter query. And this is why we had to spy earlier, because otherwise Jest wouldn't be watching this function for us, but now it is. And lastly, we'll expect that it return a user. So in this case, we'll expect that the user we got set to up here in our before each block is equaling our user stub, and we can call this user stub here. And remember, this is because in our mock, our user model, we provided the user stub as the entity stub, and we're simply just returning it as part of our exec function here. So if we run this test, we see it did fail because the find one is actually receiving some extra properties, the version 0 and the ID 0. And this is because when we set up find one, we can see we actually told it to not project the ID and the version. So this is good. It tells us that our test is working properly, but it also means in here, so here in our to be called with, we'll provide a second object, pass the ID of 0 and the version of 0, because that's what find one actually gets called with. So if we go ahead and run this again, we can see everything's passing now, which is great. So find one is very similar to find. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the whole block and change it to find. The only differences are going to be, it's going to be an array of users. We'll have users. We're going to spy on the find function, change this to users, change the actual call, but the filter query will remain the same. We're still looking by ID. And now we expect that find is called with the user filter query, and there's no projection in this case. And then users should be an array of user stubs. So let's see if that worked properly. If we quickly rerun this. So it looks like the problem here now is that it's returning the exec function from our find call. So if we go ahead and look at our user model and our mock model, it looks like we don't actually need to return the exec function here. We can actually just return the entity stub, an array of entity stubs. So let's go ahead and do that, which will change our return type here to believe it is async. So let's go ahead and look at the entity repository. Yeah, so we don't actually call exec here. We're going to turn this into an async function, return a promise of type T, and that's all it'll look like. So now let's go ahead and run our test again. It should work now. Great, so now our tests are passing. All right, so 2 more to go. Let's do the find one and update. I'll just copy this block again so we have a similar structure, but now this is going to be describing find one and update. When find one and update is called, well, we're only going to be getting back a single user now. We're going to be spying on find one and update. So we'll change this back to user. We're going to be calling find one and update. We still pass in the user query, but now we need to pass in updates. So update entity data. In this case, I'll just pass in the entire user stub just to make it simple. We still expect to call the user model, but now we expect to call find one and update. So it should be called with the user filter query. It should then be called with the updates we provided it, so the user stub. And if we take a look, we also are doing the new property, So we expect it to be called with that as well. So new should be set to true here, which just means we're returning the new entity. And then user should be the single user stub. So let's go ahead and run that one more time. And that looks good. All right, so the last unit test we have is for the create. And the create is going to be the most complex of all of these because of how we're doing it in the repository. So I'm just going to copy the find one update block, change it to create. We're still going to have the user here, but there's a couple of other lets that we're going to declare. The first of it is going to be the save spy, which is going to be a jest spy instance, and then a constructor spy, which will be a jest.spy instance as well. We'll see what we're going to do with these in a second. So if we look at what's going on in the entity repository, we can't actually spy directly on a function like find one and update or find. We can spy on create and expect that it gets their data, but really what we're more interested in is that we are calling or instantiating the entity model here with that data. So that's really what we want to spy on. So in order to do that, we'll go ahead, get rid of this, and we're going to set the save spy equal to jest.spy_on, and then we're going to call user model.prototype. So we're going to spy on the prototype of it and the save function. So in the user model, we have the save function here. And the reason why we can't spy on it directly with the user model that we've defined up here is because this user model that we've declared up here is the one that Nest.js has injected for us. But in the case of our test, we're instantiating a new model. So this is a completely different object. So the save function on here is going to be different. So we want to spy on the prototype of it so that really any object that gets instantiated, the new object that gets instantiated, we can look into it. And similarly, for the constructor spy, we'll do something similar. We're going to spy on the user model prototype, and this will be the constructor spy function that we saw earlier. Now our user here is going to be set to await user repository.create, and we'll pass in our user stub here. So now we still expect the user model to get called, but now we'll expect that our spies, so save spy, gets called. So the save function got called, and our constructor function, our constructor spy, got called with our user stub. So this is really great. It tests that we've instantiated the new model and then called save on it, which is really what we care about mostly here. And then lastly, it should still be returning a user. So let's go ahead and run this test. So if we go ahead and run the test now, we're going to see that we're actually running into some errors about this.entity model not being a constructor. And in general, this setup is kind of blowing up. And the reason for that is because we need a separate module for our create operations and for our find operations. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not completely clear as to why this is. I've kind of chalked it up to how Nest is instantiating the providers at runtime. But to show you what I mean here, let's create another block called describe, and this will be our find operations. And simply all we're going to do is we're going to keep the user's repository in the upper scope, but we're just going to move all of our find related code into this block here. Okay, and then we'll just fix the indentation. So now all of our find operations are scoped here, and we'll do the same thing for create. We're going to create a new block here called create operations. Put in before each block, so it's really the same thing as above for our find operations. But now we're going to move this create inside of here, and we'll go ahead and indent this. We have two separate modules being instantiated for our create operations and for our find operations. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure why this is necessary. I've just figured it out through experimentation. So if you have any ideas, please do let me know in the comments below. So after we run it, we see everything works as expected. So this is great. This is how I go about unit testing my repositories and all of my other files as well. So we didn't do the user's service, but that would be a good exercise for you to try out. You know, creating a repository mock here, similar how we did to the user service, and trying that out. I plan on doing another video about integration testing next, so if you'd like to see that, make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned. Thanks.